Well, listen, it is that time again. That's right. Listen, we are gathered here today because we are looking to have our relationships empowered. That's right. Listen, we're looking to have our relationships empowered. And because we're looking for empowerment and maximization in our relationships, listen, we don't come here by happenstance. Listen, we don't come here by accident. We come here on purpose. And so listen, I thank you for bearing with me here a little bit today as we were having a few technical difficulties, but I believe that we have worked it all out and we are ready to do what we do best. And because listen, this is how we do it. Listen, this is how we make it happen. Then listen, we are here today. And listen, you know how we do. That's right, listen. We don't want to come here alone. Why is it that we don't want to come here alone? Why? Because we're not in relationship alone. We're in relationship with somebody or some people. And because we're in relationship with somebody or some persons, listen, when we learn together, we grow together. Listen, let me say that to you again. When we learn together, we grow together. So I want you to take the time now to begin to invite and bring people right into this space and place. That's right, because when we are looking to make a difference in our relationships, that's right, listen, we have to acquire knowledge, information, understanding, and listen, and that's exactly what we do. So listen, whether you're here on YouTube, whether you're here on Facebook, we're asking that we always do what we know that we need to do. That's right, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Listen, like our Life Empowerment Church page. Listen, we're saying subscribe, hit the bell so you can get the notifications, follow us. Why? Because we believe that we have great things to offer. We believe that we have some great things to say, and we think that you should be a part of any and every engagement because we know that when we grow together, when we learn together, we are maximized for life and eternity. And so listen, so I want to just go ahead and thank you for joining, being with us today. Listen, we're going to go ahead and dive right into it today. That's right. We're going to go ahead and dive right into it today. And so listen, so I just want to thank you so much for you not only being here today, but you taking the opportunity to invite somebody here with you. And so listen, as you know that we're talking about communication that delivers. That's right. Listen, we're talking about communication that delivers. And in particular, we're talking about the ear art. Now, listen, if you were here with me on last week, you know that we were talking about these listening skills. We were talking about the importance and the art of listening. But listen, this is not just for romantic relationships. This is not just for friendly relationships. This is for all relationships. So whether it's personal or professional relationships, here's what we do know. Communication bridges the gap. That's right. Listen, communication bridges the gap. And because communication bridges that gap, therefore, listen, we want to understand this first thing, and that is what's communication. Now, if you were here with me last week, you were here with me the week before, I appreciate it. But always know that we have new people come in, we have new people watching. And so I always want to make sure that we start off on the same page. And so we have defined what's communication. Here's communication. Good communication is the art of sending and receiving a clear message. Let me say that to you again. Good communication is the art of sending and receiving a clear message. And because it entails all of those particular components, we've highlighted that it's an art, which says that, listen, this is not something that you wake up knowing how to do. This is not something that simply because you desire, or you simply say, hey, I can speak a language, doesn't mean that you have the skills. So communication is a skill set. Listen, and it is a skill set in being able to send a clear message, being able to receive a clear message, and listen, being able to know what that looks like. As much as we say it as simple as we try to make it, the reality is we all need help in understanding what does this look like. And so one of the passages that we have used, because listen, when we talk about communication, communication is not just something that is verbal. Communication is not something that is just physical. Communication is something that is also spiritual. There is a spiritual component to communication. And so we always like to read a particular verse that highlights what it is that we are discussing. So here in Proverbs 18, verse 13, Proverbs 18, verse 13 reads this way. It says, he who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. He says, he who answers a matter. So that tells me that when we go back to our definition of communication, it is the art of sending and receiving a clear message. That when we think about being on the listening side, when we think about being on the hearing side of things, it is the realization that, listen, I have to understand the matter before I can respond appropriately, before I can respond accurately. He says, listen, it is going to be folly and shame. How many times is it, listen, and we all have done this. We have said something, reacted to something. We have interrupted the person and began to try to answer the question or try to give them a response before they had finished their statement, only for us to find out that we didn't really hear the whole matter. And so therefore, listen, we are talking about ear art today. That's right, ear art. And so remember, good communication is the art of sending and receiving. And so when we talk about ear art, we're talking about how do we receive the message? How are we processing? How are we able to make sense out of what it is that we have heard? Now, we talked last week about the art of listening, and we were talking about all the skills that come with the ability to listen. But listen, this week I want to talk to you about the art of negative listening. Now, listen, you may hear that and you may see that and you say, the art of negative listening, really? And I'm saying, yes, really. You and I can develop a negative art of listening. And when you and I develop a negative art of listening, listen, you are listening, but your filtration system, the way that you're processing it, the way that you are ascribing meaning to what it is that you're hearing is often in the wrong direction. And so today, listen, as we are talking today about the art of negative listening, listen, I want you to be able to understand this statement. And we said it last week, and it's worth saying it again. Listen, most people today feel misunderstood and unheard. Most people. Research has shown it. You probably can identify with that statement and you can say, yeah, I've been in that space and place where one of those ones that, and it may not be often, but the fact that it has happened frequently or it has happened significantly or that it has happened to where it has had a significant impact on you says that you and I have to really be intentional about our listening, not just capacity, not just ability, but our art of listening. And so therefore, listen, the art of negative listening. Now remember, this is one of those engagements in which, listen, you can answer or you can ask questions in the here and now. So whether you're on our YouTube or you're on our Facebook page, listen, you can answer, you can ask those questions, and I will be sure to definitely answer you if you put those questions in a place where I can see it. And so I'm looking here. I don't see any questions so far. And so let us go ahead and move forward. So we're talking about the art of negative listening. Now, when we talk about the art of negative listen, let me say this before we even get started. The person who has the ability to listen is the person who can be most helpful. Sometimes the ability to just hear a person does wonders beyond sometimes description. You know, one of the reasons why people will often go to a therapist is because they don't feel heard. They do not feel like the people in their space and place, or sometimes they don't feel like they have a safe place. They don't feel like it's trustworthy enough. And so therefore, they will pay a therapist to sit and to hear and to listen to their story, because listen, the person who has the ability to listen is sometimes the person who can be the most helpful. And so when we talk about this negative listening, the first one that I want to talk to you about is what we call passive listening. Passive listening. Now, passive listening, listen, let me just tell you this. Passive listening is when we're hearing the words of the person without responding. See, you can hear the words but not hear the meaning. You can hear what the person is saying but not really pick up on the heartbeat behind what they're saying. Sometimes they can tell you, the person who is passive listening, sometimes they can tell you what you said, but they can't really tell you what you meant. And because this passive listening is often a deterrent to somebody feeling heard and being heard, this is when you and I have to recognize that passive listening may mean that we're physically present, but we're mentally absent. Sometimes it means that we're also heart absent. So we're in the room, we're in the space, we're on the phone, we're in the Zoom call, we're in the space and place where the exchange is taking place physically, but we're not there with our mind. Well, sometimes we're not there with our heart. And what ends up happening is that we will miss the cues within the conversation. We will miss the emotional cues. We will miss the physical cues. And so the person is communicating beyond words. You remember, if you go back when we first started this, we were talking about the whole exchange in communication. And when we looked at the pie chart, one of the things that we understand is that nonverbal communication is the highest level of communication. And so we understand that a person can be communicating way before they ever open their mouth. They can say a whole lot with their facial expressions, with their bodily expressions, and therefore you and I can miss the entire message. I heard your words, but did you catch the message? And so this is where, when we're talking about passive listening, there has to be an intention to listen to the person without distraction. That's right. Listen, when you and I are having a conversation in which we are exchanging, we're talking, we're sharing, the less distractions we have, the more that we're going to pick up in the conversation from the other person, the more that we're going to be able to communicate to the person who is talking that I'm interested in what you have to say, that I am giving you my attention because what you have to say is important. It is whether I'm giving you eye contact, whether I am engaging with you. It is the reality that I am communicating to you that what you have to say is important. And how many times is it that you and I have been in a conversation where we had something that we really wanted to share, and we found out that what we had to share wasn't worth the person's time and consideration for listening? And so therefore, listen, passive listening is one of those things that can really deter somebody from engaging with you and I. And therefore, you and I have to be conscious about our phones. That's right. Listen, you can look at your phones and you can be on your phone, and before you know it, you're like, what did you say? What were you talking about? Can you repeat that again? And granted, there are times in which we may have to say to the person, hey, I'm expecting an urgent reply. There's something that's going on. There's an emergency. There's a crisis. There's a deadline. We may have to let the person know, hey, I'm doing this not because what you're saying is important, but there was something that was kind of already cooking before we got started. And so sometimes we have to give those exceptions to the case, but the reality is that not every text is a crisis. Not every phone call requires a picking up. Sometimes you have to be able to say, you know what, that's why we have voicemail. That's the reason why we have a texting system, so that I can respond when I have a moment, not necessarily respond simply because you just text me. And so this is why passive listening can be such a deterrent to engaging personal, even professional conversations, so that you and I lose the person. We may be able to go back and say, well, hey, I know what you were saying, but listen, the person is what's important. The conversation is only an extension of the person. And so therefore, when you and I are having conversation, we have to be engaging and being able to look at what's happening in this conversation. What are they saying with their body? What are they saying in their facial expressions? What are they saying in their tone of voice? What are they communicating? Because I need to hear the entire conversation. I would tell you, some people wonder whether or not they are good listeners. I tell you, this is one way to gauge whether or not you and I are fully engaged into what God is trying to say to you and I in the conversations between the persons. And so therefore, sometimes the reason why you and I have a passive take in conversations is because sometimes we're just preoccupied. We have a lot that's going on in our minds, and therefore we are sometimes so busy thinking about what's happening outside the conversation that we tend to have a tendency to kind of not so much doze off, like go to sleep, but we go to sleep on the conversation. And so therefore, listen, preoccupation is one of those things that can really disrupt your ability to engage in the conversation. Sometimes you have to be able to just get your mind together before you even go into a conversation. Sometimes you got to take a mental break and kind of get your thoughts together, get your energy together so that you can engage. And listen, this is sometimes even very noticeable when you and I are worried about some things, we're stressed out about some things. Sometimes you need to be able to say to the person that's trying to communicate with you, listen, I would love to have this conversation right now, but the reality is I'm not in my best place. I'm not in my best space. And that's okay, but I need to communicate that so that I'm not setting our conversation up for failure. This is the reason why, listen, preoccupation can be one of those things. Here's another one that I think sometimes we don't always recognize, and that is placating. You've been in that conversation where the person is just giving you responses because they want you to move on, not because they really hear you. They will even agree, yeah, you're right about that, and you know that they don't really believe that. But they'll just say, yeah, oh, yeah, you're right. And really what's happening in that moment is that person's not putting any effort into understanding, and it often comes across as if they don't care. And let me just say this at this point. Listen, if you're in a relationship that is meaningful, significant, one that is of value to you, or one that is growing in that direction, it's important that you say something. You can't always expect that somebody's, quote, going to pick up on it. They're going to figure it out. They're going to somehow realize it. No, listen, this is why we're in relationship. This is the reason why we have a connection, so that we can learn together, so that we can grow together. And therefore, I can assume that you know what your behavior, what your language, what your what your interactions are doing, and how they're helping, how they're not helping. And so therefore, I owe it to you to tell you what's working, what's not working. And so placating is sometimes a passive listening trait. It comes across sometimes as one minimizing even the seriousness of the situation. And you will begin to feel sometimes like you're dismissed. It will sometimes, in a situation where you're looking to be celebrated, you can feel de-appreciated simply because there is this placating that is going on. And this is why, even if you're smiling, you're nodding, you're grunting, you're giving all the indications like, yeah, I'm listening, the reality is I'm just placating. And so we've got to work on this if we're going to have the kind of listening that's not negative, but it's engaging, and it actually brings about an engagement in the conversation that we both enjoy. You know, this next one that I want to talk to you about is all about, what's that one? It's competitive listening. I think I wrote down comprehensive, but that should have been competitive listening. So when you and I are talking about competitive listening, now listen, this can show up in different ways. Sometimes it shows up when you're trying to share something great and wonderful, and the other person somehow, for whatever reason, wants to share a story that is maybe on the same level, or they're trying to feel like, or they feel like somehow they're trying to up you. Like, you know, your story's good, but my story is greater. You know, your experience was good, but mine was terrific. Sometimes you have that kind of exchange. I think that there's more things that are happening beneath the surface that I really don't want to get into today, but that is one of those ways in which you have this kind of competitive listening. But then it can also show up in the form of where we're not listening to understand, we're listening to respond. And there's a point in which that is appropriate in the process of the conversation. But there is also a place where that is not appropriate in the conversation. And this is when you recognize that you're listening only to figure out how to respond to the person. And you're not really listening to understand what they're trying to communicate. You're not really listening to understand their heart and to understand their mind and to understand their feelings and all the things that go along with it. You're simply saying, I don't like what I'm hearing. I don't think what they're saying is right. And so therefore I begin to form my own argument. And before you know it, I'm actually going over what I'm going to say in my mind, how I'm going to present it. And all the while the person is talking, and it's impossible for you and I to really grasp what the person is communicating when we are so busy trying to figure out how to respond. And so this can be one of those competitive listening traits where this is negative because I'm not really listening to hear you. I'm listening to hear me. I'm listening to myself because I'm trying to prepare me for you. And really, it can really turn into this kind of me against you sort of scenario. It may not necessarily be major and very tense, but it can have that kind of impact. And then there is another way in which I think this competitive listening will show up, and that is this one, is when I'm filtering out what you're saying only to take the points that I want to reinforce, especially if I'm setting up for an argument. When or maybe I'm trying to discount the validity of what you're saying. And so I'm really filtering out your message. I'm listening to you, but I'm not listening to really be engaging. I'm not listening to really hear your heart. I'm really just listening to pick apart what it is that you're saying. And that does not work for a relationship. Now, listen, that may work in court. Listen, that may work in some other, maybe some other kind of setting. But here we're talking about how do we really engage and build these kind of relationships that we want to be a part of, that are fulfilling, that are enjoyable, that they are the ones that we say, I call you friend, I call you spouse, I call you partner, I call you all of these sort of things. Why? Because we hold something of value. And so when we begin to have these kind of tactics, we really are saying, or sometimes without noticing, that I'm devaluing you, I'm devaluing the relationship. And so when we have this competitive listening, it can show up when I'm trying to up the ante on your story versus my story. I'm preparing to only react to what it is that you're saying, or I'm just filtering through your conversation. I'm picking out the points that are setting me up for either discounting or not even sometimes hearing what you have to say, because I am simply looking to argue. Which kind of takes me into my next point, that when we talk about negative listening skills. Now, once again, if you have any questions, you can be sure to put those questions there in the comment section. Here where we talk about combative listening. Combative listening. Listen, this is where you know for sure that the person is looking for confrontation. This is where you know for sure that the person, listen, is looking. Listen, it's not a question. It's not a wonder. It's clear, listen, that we're only moving towards combativeness. This is where, listen, they may want to argue just for the sake of arguing. And sometimes this happens simply because people are in a bad mood. Sometimes people have had a rough day. Sometimes just a variety of things are just kind of going awry in their lives. And so you kind of catch them at a bad moment, you catch them at a bad time, and they're just in this sort of mode where they're just ready to fight. And it may not be a physical fight, but it can be an emotional fight. It can be a psychological fight. And sometimes this is why when you can listen well, you can pick up on these cues, you can pick up on these vibes. And even if the other person doesn't back out of the conversation, you can say, you know what? I don't think now's a good time. I think let's put this to the side. It may even be one of those things where you begin to shift and you say, what's going on with you? What has happened today? And because you pick up on that, it shifts and changes everything. Remember, the person who is willing to listen is the person that is often most helpful. And so therefore, this combative listening, they're active listening. They're paying attention. But listen, they're only paying attention to challenge you or to combat you in some way. Listen, this is when they would rather disagree than hear and understand or even try to understand what you are saying. This is why there are some conversations that I've noticed that I have with people that, especially if you begin to talk about maybe religion, or you begin to talk about politics, you begin to talk about some other maybe controversial issue, that sometimes the relationship does not have the kind of substance that can withstand that kind of challenging conversation, challenging in views and challenging in beliefs and challenging in different perspectives about what's right, what's good, what's not. And sometimes you have to just say that we don't have the kind of relationship right now where we can go into those kinds of topics and those kind of discussions. And that's not bad. There's nothing disingenuous about that. It is the reality that, listen, I'm trying to preserve what we have. I'm trying to keep what we have and to build on that so that maybe one day we would be able to have those kind of discussions. Sometimes combative listening can look like debating. Listen, let me just say this. Listen, you can't listen when you're invested in debating. Let me say that again. You can't listen when you are invested in debating. This is when often, listen, it turns into a lot of interruptions. It turns into a lot of disputing. It turns into this type of arguing. And at that moment, listen, we're not adding any value to the conversation. We're not adding any kind of significant moments to our relationship. If anything, it can really serve as a subtraction. Now, let me say this. I am a hardcore believer that we have to have tough conversations. Don't get me wrong. And sometimes tough conversations will bring a certain amount of emotionality to it. I get that. I understand that. But what I'm saying here is that you've got to be able to rightfully divide the times and places and spaces when to have those. Because I promise you, there are many people who have lost good relationships because they tried to have conversations that the relationship was not structured and strengthened and fortified enough to be able to endure it. And I'm saying that, listen, if we want to have the kind of relationships that we want to come back to, the kind of relationships that we want to enjoy, the kind of relationships that we say, hey, this is worth the sacrifice, this is worth the time, this is worth the investment, I'm saying to you that sometimes we've got to recognize when this has gone amok, when this is not going in the right direction. You know, one of the other ways in which we recognize that is when we find that we, or sometimes the other person, is simply being defensive. Listen, when a person is being defensive, sometimes it's because they feel threatened. Sometimes they feel threatened in the relationship. Sometimes they feel like they have to somehow take one side or the other. They feel like either I'm for you or I'm against you. And so therefore it becomes this entire sort of match of where we are defending not the relationship, but we're defending our views. We're defending our perspectives. We're defending these sort of values. Now, once again, don't get me wrong. There are times and spaces and places where that is definitely appropriate. But when we're saying, I'm trying to have a relationship with you, and this is the kind of thing that is not helping us, this is not taking us in the right direction, then this is when we've got to look at what is most meaningful, what is most important. And this is when, listen, sometimes, you know, we can overreact to certain words. We can overreact to certain phrases. Listen, we can get so invested into guarding ourselves that we don't even get the actual message that the person or persons are communicating. And therefore, we get lost in the translation of what's actually being said. And we actually begin to feel like who's my friend, who's my confidant, has actually turned into my enemy. My coworker has now just entered into the dark side. And so therefore, before you know it, we are no longer really listening to learn. We're listening to defend. And the moment that our hearts and our minds and our spirits have turned in that direction is often the indication that this is not going to work for any of us because we're not really actively listening to build. we're actively listening to destroy. And therefore, this is the kind of thing that begins to rob us of the kind of fulfillment in any and all of our relationships, because negative listening never, ever works. Let me say that to you again. Negative listening never, ever works. So whether we talk about it from the passive all the way up to the combative, it just gets worse as we move up the ladder, and it definitely doesn't get better. And so listen, I am pastor and therapist Marcus Ruffin. And listen, I am here to help maximize your relationships. I am here to help you to learn, to grow, to sometimes even have an introspection of what is it that I'm bringing? What is it that I am subtracting? What is it that I am causing to bring this to a deficit instead of the compound, positive, building effect? And so listen, I thank you so much for being here today. Listen, remember, most people feel misunderstood and unheard. And if there's one thing that we can do better in our relationships, that is to listen. So whether it's personal or professional, doesn't matter what side of the relationships that we're discussing, communication bridges the gap. And so listen, I thank you so much for being here for RUFF'N IT. I thank you so much for you being able to invest in your relationships. And listen, if this has been a blessing to you, if you have found this to be helpful and enriching, I always say, listen, if they weren't here for the live, let them watch it on the rebroadcast. Send the link to them from YouTube. Listen, you can share this on your Facebook so that they can get this and be a part of this. And so listen, I just want you to know that not only do I appreciate you being here, but I also appreciate the fact that you would take time out to even support what is happening here. That's right. Listen, we thank you for partnering with us here at LifeEmpowermentCh. And listen, and there is definitely a way for you to return the investment. Listen, as you see here on the screen, you see that you can make that contribution digitally here through Cash App. And so because you can do that through Cash App, LifeEmpowermentCh, you can do that there. Listen, there are some of you that you actually prefer to use one of these other methods, and that's cool too. You can do that through PayPal here at LEC at let-god.org. And so listen, so you can be sure to make that investment here through our PayPal. And listen, there's some of you that you like the old traditional way, and there's nothing wrong with that. Listen, you would like to mail a check. You would like to send a money order. And as you can see here on the screen, here is our P.O. Box, Life Empowerment Church, P.O. Box 7958, Moreno Valley, California, 92552. And so listen, we thank you for you being here today. We thank you for your time. And we thank you that this has been an enrichment. This has been an investment. And most importantly, this has been empowerment. And so we thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again on next Thursday as we continue RUFF'N IT and communication that delivers. You be blessed.